The artist turns into a person more defined by their personal charisma rather than by their actual artistic output. These artists tend to act as a moral compass for society, as if the ability to portray another person on screen or playing a violin concerto is in any way indicative of political insight. And artistic merit or fame isn't what counts anyway, since regularly we hear social commentary from poets no one ever read a line from, so it isn't necessarily their artistic success that qualifies them, but their willingness to act as a bullhorn for political activism. Hello, and welcome to another episode of That Other Channel I Don't Want My Boss to Know About. My name is David Bols, and this is the first time I'm actually releasing some new content from my new studio. You see, at first I did the usual thing, hitting the refresh button on my Facebook feed every 2 minutes, hoping to stumble across an interesting article I could retell in my own words on my channel, just like the 100 other YouTubers that have done so faster than me. Then I figured that this wasn't very original at all, and so I became depressed instead. But luckily I had another idea. I decided to do something for here and for here, and so I decided to start reading some more books again. Books are sufficiently unpopular today to allow me to carve my own unique niche, while at the same time stimulating me to keep thinking further. Also, my wife thinks it makes me come across more intellectual, and so I was finally sold. A long story short, today's video will be about a book, but not necessarily just a traditional book review, but rather a comment on some of the issues I have with it, as well as a small introduction to a larger topic, the music industry, that springs from it and that I've wanted to discuss on this channel for a long time already. I've already hinted at some aspects of it in my Me Too video series, but since there are so many aspects to discuss, I'm expecting bits and pieces to creep into many of my upcoming videos in the near future. Now, after my first script turned out to be something like half an hour video, the mere thought of translating this into German, since I'm planning to run this channel bilingually at least for some time, was just so discouraging that I decided to try and wing it without a script. I did a couple of test runs, which might have been okay, but I didn't feel really happy with it as a solution either, at least for now. So ultimately I decided there's only one solution: limit myself to the essentials. As such, my biggest challenge is to try and avoid discussing every little detail and tangent that comes to my mind, as I have to remind myself that I'll fill those gaps in the long run once I've made more videos. The second biggest challenge is to avoid overly long and elaborate intros that no one cares about. The book I first want to discuss is Gidon Kremer's Letters to a Young Female Pianist. The book is from 2013 and was, to my knowledge, only released in German and French. I'll put a link to the German version in the description. I knew of this book's existence for some time, but I never really got around to reading it, and I almost forgot about its existence until a friend, a very good pianist in his own right, reminded me of it recently. My idea was that it's something to finally catch up on, as it's a book that should be very much down my alley. Kremer has been known to criticize the music industry on more than one occasion, most famously possibly in his open letter to the organizers of the Verbier Festival in 2011, in which he pulled out of the festival because he didn't want to participate in, let's sum it up as, the celebrity rat race. The book Letters to a Young Pianist is a continuation of these thoughts, a more fleshed out version of the issues he talks about in his initial letter. These 10 letters form also the first part of the book. They're written like real letters, also often referring to other musicians by names, and dated from autumn 2010 till early 2012. So pretty much the same period during which he became fed up with the Verbier Festival. The recipient's name has been changed to Aurelia, and the internet is full of rumors that it's indeed a collection of slightly altered letters Kremer wrote to the young Georgian pianist Khatia Bunyatishvili. Who knows whether it's true, but it does seem to make sense to an extent, as Kremer was one of the first supporters of her young career. The overall idea behind these letters is very similar to his letter to Verbeer. Kremer offers advice to the young pianist who is standing at the brink of a potentially great career, and he is warning her of the many pitfalls and temptations that await her. It's a one-way discussion, sometimes interspersed with imaginary answers, a bit as if it's a Socratic dialogue, but it's hard to tell to which degree this advice was welcomed. He warns her of the temptations of stardom and the almost inevitable betrayal of true art that would come as a result of it. He talks about managers, agents, journalists, labels that all only want to sell her and that don't care about the art itself. And he reminds her to orient herself along the lines of the great masters, whether it's composers or performers, to help her resist the urge to impress with hollow virtuosity, and so forth. The second part of the book is an ironic dream sequence called Nightmare Symphony, which describes a world in which an orchestra of the worst musicians becomes fantastically successful. It is a very satirical piece and yet probably the weakest part of the whole book. You see, the thing with satire such as this is that it's maybe among the most difficult literary forms to pull off convincingly without becoming cliched or too much in your face. And while Kremer certainly has a good command of language, this section shows that he isn't really quite on the level to avoid these traps and master this style like a great author would. The last section consists of A Musician's 10 Commandments, in which Kremer pretty much repeats many of his criticisms from the initial letters. I do find that section, however, to be more to the point, probably because he can focus in each commandment on the points he wants to make, rather than compromising the ideas through the formal demands of letters. As such, this section is probably the better summary of his thoughts than the initial letters that tend to be a bit all over the place. So much for a quick summary to the book. Now let's dive into some details. Quod licet Jovi, non licet bovi, goes the old saying, and no one's really exactly sure of where it came from. For those of you that don't know at least a bit of Latin to show off at dinner parties or YouTube videos, this is basically a colorful saying about double standards. What Jupiter is allowed to do, the ox isn't. Funnily enough, the Romans seem to have a couple of sayings including oxes, a rather peculiar obsession if you ask me, but I digress. This saying describes as well a positive as a negative aspect of this book. First off, it's great to have one of the world's best-known violinists speak out against the way careers are made in the music world. As a matter of fact, it is validation for all of those people that secretly think similar things but can't say them because they are at the lowest step of the career ladder and would therefore risk being sneered at by their peers and competitors. Simply put, if I'd say the same things, people would call me jealous because I don't have a career of note. But if Kremer says it, it is insightful. Now, that could be in and of itself another reason to be jealous of Kremer, and it could even serve as another example of what's fair or not fair in the music world, but that's not the point here. What's more important is that young artists in the classical music world are nowadays expected to be mostly enthusiastic and positive about their art, often in an attempt to appeal to a younger audience. Criticisms and doubts are only permitted when it comes to a few select political topics, and even those are heavily regulated. But more about that later. It's worth pointing out that not everybody applauded Kremer's statements and this book. People accuse him of criticizing a system that has helped him achieve the career and the status that he enjoys right now, and there's at least a grain of truth in that as well. I do believe, however, that the answer to that should be to be utterly thorough in your analysis and criticism of the system, and not to exempt yourself from this criticism. And thereby lies a tale, for Kremer does mention several times that he made wrong decisions in his younger years, but he fails to specify what they were, why he took those chances, and especially whether he could rightfully assume that he'd been in a comparable position of fame and status if he hadn't made those wrong decisions in the past. He also fails to explain the difference between hollow virtuosity and meaningful virtuosity, or even more importantly, between having a supportive teacher, benefiting from your network and being outright mafia. We would be kidding us were we to assume that there aren't a ton of grey areas that live between those extremes. So this is where the negative quodlicet Jovi rears its ugly head. The fact that Kremer isn't really reflecting critically on his own career-building process. He stresses how he cultivated an uncomfortable image early in his career, but fails to see that the market, at least back then, was equally happy to sell some kind of eccentricity as it is nowadays trying to sex everything up. Ultimately, Kremer always demands an uncompromising attitude from young musicians that he himself never adhered to strictly, one that, if anything, he can permit himself now in his older age, where he's established himself as one of the most famous violinists in the world. This kind of double standard is the negative variant of quodlicet Jovi. After accusing Kremer of double standards, I should set the record straight and point out that there are many correct things he points out in his book. And as of recording this video, I'm still torn whether his double standards are a result of deliberate choices or of a certain naivete. I do think, however, that this question is not unimportant, since this book specifically, and his opinion in general, are among the few prominent examples raised from within the ranks of famous musicians criticizing the classical music industry. As such, the burden is huge, especially when it's quite obvious that Kremer does have a certain intellectual foundation that not only should allow him to see things through to the end, but that is almost expected from him by his readers based on how he presents himself. And this is the point where the disappointment is probably biggest, as the truths he presents sometimes remain a bit superficial, so that they almost ring more like truisms than truths, and that is a shame, a real missed opportunity. When I earlier said that he doesn't reflect enough on his own position on the market, that he isn't really above the market, and frankly no one nowadays really is, then that's a perfect example of this problem. Because by not reflecting thoroughly, his advice will ring hollow when he warns people of certain career choices, because ultimately, the only advice they can get from him is, don't do it this way, do it my way. Which might sound to Kremer himself as if it means just focusing on the art, but people looking in from the outside will quickly notice that this is not a complete answer to the problem. The legions of talented musicians full of integrity that never made a big career are a stark reminder for us that not everyone is lucky enough to be rewarded with a career for his musical integrity. And this is exactly what I'd expect Kremer to acknowledge in one way or another. He does mention them in passing once, sort of like glorified examples of integrity. But given his own status and position, it does feel a bit like preaching water and drinking wine, only that he throws in a few lines afterwards where he regrets having had the wine earlier when he really should have had the water. All of which leads us back to quodlicet Jovi. But the truth versus truism dilemma is not only apparent in his self-reflection, but also in the somewhat unsatisfactory use of concepts such as true artistry, hollow virtuosity, or even a dangerous term such as musicality. All of these terms sound familiar, and as long as we are in agreement artistically, they can be a vague reference point to confirm to each other that we're on the same page. But ultimately, those terms say very little that can be considered tangible and precise. Granted, music is notoriously hard to put into words, which is also part of its appeal. But if you decide to write a book, one that is even rather judgmental, then you'd better stay away from imprecise language such as this. There are a few examples which make this rather apparent. For instance, in the story of a young conductor with whom Kremer obviously disagreed on the interpretation of a piece. There was a bit of a scandal by Kremer, one which I find frankly rather unprofessional to pull off in public. And when they had a discussion afterwards in the dressing room, Kremer basically pulled the age and experience card, putting the conductor in his place by basically calling upon his status as a more mature artist. Let's not kid ourselves, this is not a convincing argument in any way or shape. It is an act of power, of exerting dominance over another person simply because of who you are. And while this might not be unheard of, especially coming from conductors of the past, there is a noticeable discrepancy between Kremer's outward humbleness and the way he decided to enforce his way in this situation. And don't be mistaken, my main criticism of Kremer isn't that he acted that way, rather that he isn't honestly reflecting on this behavior and instead uses vague terminology about musicality to cover up what's really going on. Therefore, I can't help but come to the conclusion that for anybody who is already keeping a critical eye on the music industry, Kremer's book isn't going to give you a ton of new insights. He's mostly covering all the bases on the surface level. And that's a bit of a letdown. Due to the length of this video, I'm going to cut this video in half here. Don't miss the second part though, as that's where I'll talk next about the hot topic of being political as an artist. Oh boy.